Press, which is a great sign because people often say to me, reforming Whitehall is quite a sort of technical, even a less sexy topic to discuss. And I am shocked, as I can see the Minister is as well, that anyone would suggest that, because actually if you can't get the machinery of government, if you can't get Whitehall, I guess the nucleus, if you like, of government to work effectively, then of course you can't get everything else to work well. And that is why we at Reform are so passionate about what, as I say, some may see as a technical topic in reforming Whitehall, but is actually the fundamental basis of making sure that public services and the public sector operates as well as it can do. So thank you so much. I know that it's a highly competitive fringe. There are numerous events going on. I am thrilled that you have chosen to join us today for what I'm sure will be a fascinating hour of discussion on how we make Whitehall fit to deliver, a machine that can really deliver the government's priorities. I honestly, I have the privilege obviously of chairing a lot of events, but sometimes you have a good panel, but sometimes you have an outstanding panel, and I think that is exactly what we have today. I don't think we could have a better set of people to talk about how we reform Whitehall and really make sure it delivers for the country, for the nation, for citizens, however you want to express it. Obviously, first up, we have the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Jeremy Quin, who is indeed responsible for this agenda, for leading the reform, for delivering the government declaration on reform. Huge amounts going on that Jeremy is driving forward, from diversifying the talent in the civil service to making sure we actually make the most of the phenomenal asset that is data, making sure that we're applying the right digital infrastructure using technology, a whole host of activity that is designed to improve the way the Whitehall machine functions. So we're thrilled, Jeremy, you have joined us today as the key person in charge of this agenda. We then have, of course, Lord Maude, Francis Maude, a predecessor in the last sort of, 13 years probably. I mean, the fact that we have the Maude reforms probably says it all, but that's what we talk about back obviously in the coalition years, very much a true reformer in the literal sense of the machine, delivering very topically for the moment billions in savings, really overhauling a lot of the professional infrastructure, or professionalising actually the infrastructure in the heart of government. And of course, currently, I think we're awaiting the review to come out that you've been doing around governance and accountability. We're awaiting publication. We are
in due course.
In due course, exactly. In the very typical civil service phrasing, which we are all very excited to receive in due course, as Simone you say. Which brings me on to Baroness Simone Finn, who has done many roles, also focused on making sure the Whitehall machine works, most recently, of course, as Deputy Chief of Staff in Downing Street, but also, if I can put it this way, sort of Lord Maude's right-hand woman in terms of delivering those reforms by the Cabinet Office in the coalition years. So again, another great reformer. And then finally we have Richard Lum at the very end of the table, as a partner at Newton Europe, who are kindly supporting this event and making this discussion possible today, who brings a wealth of experience in actually being, can I say, in the weeds of helping government departments as well as local government actually work out how you do these reforms, how you make the use of data, really looking at how you transform processes, etc., which ultimately is what this conversation will come down to. So a brilliant panel. I hope you're already all thinking of the questions that you may want to ask. This is, Reform has a big programme called Reimagining Whitehall. This is our flagship event. We have a flagship panel for you, which I'm, as I say, really thrilled about. Without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to give their opening remarks, touching on, I guess, many areas in Whitehall reform, but the bits that they feel they would like to focus in, particularly before we open it up to Q&A. So, Minister, if I can start with you, opening remarks.
Thanks, Charlotte. And you are absolutely right to be passionate about reform and about this subject. In the private sector and elsewhere, reform and how you deliver happens naturally. It has to happen. There's an imperative there to make it so. That's not the case in the public sector. It is hard. It is difficult. It requires direction and constant pushing. And I'll come on to the two on my left. But it's great that you are pushing this, and I'm very grateful for the work that Reform has done in highlighting the barriers to reform, showing how difficult it is, but how essential it is that we actually maintain the agenda and make progress, which we are. And a good way to start is by echoing your words about both Simone and Francis. Francis is my predecessor, not only as MCA, but as Member of Parliament for Horsham. I've been following in his footsteps, and it is a pleasure to do so, because since 2010, without doubt, and you refer to the reform agenda, the Conservative Party has achieved some of the most consequential reforms of a modern political generation. I won't go through all of them, because we want to talk about the future, not what we've already put in place, but putting the functions in place that saved billions. I think it was 20 billion was estimated in 2014, 2015, compared to the last years of the Labour government, in terms of doing the basic common sense reform work of buying effectively and efficiently. Establishing the IPA, and probably setting it up so that we can test and have that expertise at the heart of government. It was the building blocks on which we've continued to drive reform ever since Francis and Simone set out that agenda back in 2010. Throughout, we've been solely focused on the productivity and the efficiency of the public sector, and I'm very proud to take on that baton to continue to push the reform agenda at a time when, just like 2010, it could not be more important. I want a civil service that rejects London groupthink. Here we are in Manchester, a great place to be saying it. I want a civil service that has the capability to deliver on our agenda and is seizing the opportunity of technology, to which you refer, Charlotte. And I want to quickly take each in turn. First, for too long, we had a civil service that was too London-centric and remained in that comfortable London bubble. And as highlighted by reform, was all too eager to speak to itself. I'm determined to put a stop to that and to create an institution that best empowers views and backgrounds from right across the UK. In places like Darlington, there is a quiet revolution ongoing that will play out over generations. We have already moved 12,000 civil service posts out of London, are well ahead of schedule, and I'm very confident that we will hit all our places for growth objectives. And as a result, I will soon be setting out how we're going to expand and stretch those ambitions on this important agenda. Changing geography is just one way to challenge groupthink and to focus on a more productive civil service. I've already set out how we're making it easier to recruit into the civil service, bringing private sector thinking and expertise, making sure the basic mechanics of recruitment support rather than undermine our ambitions to succeed in that field. We need an unremitting focus on driving productivity. Taxpayer-funded activity must create value for the taxpayer, and we are scrutinising EDI activity just as we have facility time and check-off arrangements for the trade unions. Team productivity, joint learning, pastoral support and leadership, innovation. These are all critical attributes of the civil service, which is why we are right to reassess working from home patterns which were introduced in the immediate aftermath of COVID. And I will be bringing forward new guidance on working from home in the autumn. To drive a leaner, more productive civil service, we must also focus on capability. Invaluable as they are, the answer to every problem can't simply be more civil servants. We need to harness expertise and investment to benefit from technology. We've launched a digital secondments programme to do just that, and I'm determined that the much discussed capability-based pay will only be introduced if it reflects productivity and delivery. And as is obvious across the whole of our economy, we must safely seize the promise of the tech revolution, starting with the government digital roadmap, in which we set out how to lay the foundations of both better service and better data. Ultimately, the safe application of AI will represent the most significant impact on civil service productivity in generations, and for that, we need the right foundations in both talent and technology. So, our hosts today have set out the barriers to reform. We all know them. We bear the scars, and we must have political bravery to take them on. I look forward to hearing from both Francis and Simone, and reform has two components. Not you, reform in general. Civil service reform, I should say, has two components. The intermittent but eye-catching great leap forward which are vital, but it also requires constant attention to the smallest of details to keep pushing an agenda forward, which does matter for us all.
Thank you so much. And Lord Maude.
Right, well thank you, and it's a pleasure, great pleasure to follow Jeremy.
I think we always follow you.
Well, exactly. and I just to say, I couldn't be more happy to have such a brilliant successor, both as MP in Horsham, where I'm sure he's a much better MP than I was, and as Minister for the Cabinet Office. He's doing a fantastic job. Reimagining Whitehall. The question I set myself when I was asked to do this review of governance and accountability for civil servants is a question which a former permanent secretary asked. Sir John Kingman, who was former second permanent secretary of the Treasury, who delivered a lecture in the IFG a couple of years ago. Why is civil service reform so hard? He didn't particularly produce an answer, but it's the right question. And of course, as I started the work on this, you look back over the history, and you look back to the Fulton Committee 55 years ago, which was itself drawing on previous critiques. And then you read the criticisms, the reviews, the commentary there's been on the civil service in Whitehall constantly since then, and the same themes emerge time and time again. And the interesting thing is there isn't any controversy about this. No one contests that the dominance of generalists versus specialists, the dominance of policy officials versus implementation officials, the churn, the unplanned, which some civil servants say has got worse recently, unplanned movement of people between jobs, which of course promotes and perpetuates the generalist thing, because people are moving before they have time to develop deep knowledge, the separation of policy and implementation, the lack of ease and capability of dealing with data and basic management information that would be routine in other environments. And maybe one of the biggest things that covers a lot of this, and which I have a whole annex on in my riveting report, which you will thoroughly enjoy. Some people who've read it say that in Francis you've written War and Peace, but I can tell you it's much more fun than War and Peace. And this is the issue of the lack of interchange, the closed culture, the resistance to outside influence. And it's very interesting, as I've talked to lots of civil servants doing this review, they now use different words to describe this phenomenon. They talk about porosity, we must be more porous. And then sometimes they talk about ventilation, we want to be ventilated. So we don't want anything too serious, but maybe a little bit of fresh air now and again might be a good idea. And so the question is, I say, none of these things, no one says, no, these aren't issues which should be addressed. No one says they're impossible to address. I say very clearly in my review, these are hard things to change. You know, these do not happen spontaneously. They have to, you need people, leaders who will make it happen, and it requires a time span which is longer than the time span of any one government. So why doesn't it happen? Well, the first, just to give you an example of how difficult it is to sustain these things, in the time between 2010 and 2015, the size of the civil service fell by 21%, like for like, in terms of headcount and full-time equivalents. And we cut the spend on consultants, outside consultants, by 2/3. Both of those trends have reversed since, in the 8 years since. The size of the civil service has gone up pretty much to where it was in 2010, and the use of consultants has burgeoned once again, which is actually deeply frustrating for civil servants, who quite like being asked to do difficult things, and the idea that as soon as there's something difficult, you've got to get consultants in, they find annoying. So why does this happen? Well, first thing is there's no one in charge of the civil service. The head of the civil service is always a part-time job, generally shared with the cabinet secretary, and the qualities you want for the cabinet secretary, a brilliant policy official, are not the same qualities that you need for a powerful change manager, a systems leader with experience of driving change, sustainable change through a huge, complex organization. the chances of finding all those qualities in the same person are frankly nil. And even if you could find this miracle worker, you could not possibly do this job as a part-timer. So that's first thing. Second thing is you need that person, a dedicated head of the civil service, needs to be properly empowered. The law places the power to manage the civil service in the hands of the Prime Minister as Minister for the Civil Service. And everyone assumes, well, Prime Minister's delegated that to civil servants. Turns out that's not the case. The head of the civil service has no powers delegated to him to manage the civil service. And previous ones who've tried, I mean, some of them have tried splendidly to make change happen. And they say, my only levers are cajolery, charm, and persuasion. Well, you need all of those things, and getting buy-in, goodwill, all that are very good things to do. The back of it, you need power, you need authority, you need a mandate, and that simply doesn't exist. So a dedicated head of the civil service, properly empowered. And then if you have that, then how is that person going to be held to account? And of course the textbook answer is, well, ministers hold civil servants to account. And no one is better qualified than I think, to say that that's not going to be the answer. Because I did this job for 5 years. I was senior, experienced, seasoned, a leathery old professional. And I did a better job than anyone until what Jeremy is now doing. But at the end of it, you can be weighted out, and that happens. And it's a perfectly well understood and well-known phenomenon. So there needs to be, for what I call the stewardship obligation, that what must come with a permanent politically impartial civil service is an obligation of stewardship to ensure that the institution you are in charge of is absolutely prime responsibility to serve the government of the day, but to be capable of serving future governments ever better. So continuous improvement, driving through reforms through a long time span, consistently. And for that to happen, there has to be an accountability in addition to the accountability to ministers. We have a Civil Service Commission. Its role is painfully narrow at the moment, and it is in the way it has to operate, the way it's set up. It is not set up to be properly independent. There could be a way of empowering it, expanding its role to hold to account. And is there then the head of the civil service? Is there then a conflict between that and the obligation to hold account to ministers? The will of ministers must prevail, which I totally believe, yes. And if there is a conflict, there is tension between what ministers say must happen, and this will largely be around a competition for bandwidth, then it has to be called out. And there are two ways of it. The Institute for Government has said, well, the answer is to put it all on a statutory footing, have a statutory civil service board. Then you build in conflict between the government of the day and that external responsibility. The way to do it is transparency and maybe an enhanced civil service commission holding to account a dedicated head of the civil service for the delivery of these things. Sometimes what has been agreed and should be done very much on a bipartisan basis. There is no possibility of these reforms getting implemented or sustained, more importantly, unless there is bipartisan agreement. There is no politics in this at all. It is ideologically completely neutral. It is all about having an effective government machine that can serve any government that has a democratic mandate to govern. So you need that, and if there is a conflict, if there is tension, if the agreed reforms aren't being implemented in ways that have been set out, then you have the ability for a civil service commission, if that be the right body, reporting annually to Parliament to call it out. So the will of the government of the day still prevails, but it gets called out. And the power of transparency here is, I would say, more powerful than the ability to have a statutory system surrounding all of this, which I think would build in conflict. So the last thing is, the way our centre of government is set up now is archaic and is out of line with all comparable governments. Governments that have a permanent civil service, a parliamentary democracy, like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, all have a centre of government set up in a way that's roughly consistent between them, but totally at odds with ours. They will all have an office of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which brings together the secretariats of the Cabinet Office together with the Prime Minister's office to provide a strategic centre of government. And none of them have a single Ministry of Finance where control of public expenditure is housed in the same place as macro fiscal policy, macroeconomic policy, taxation, and all these other things. That the split is different in different countries, and the nomenclature is different in different places, but none of them think it makes sense to have all of that in one place. So you'll have to wait until my report is published to find out what my views and my conclusions are on these issues, but these seem to me to be some of the questions.
Thank you so much, and very much in line with our Breaking Down the Barriers theory that we published as well, so that's wonderful to hear that.
You can see why it's named War and Peace.
Exactly, so the whole
The emphasis on war.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you for inviting me on the panel. You know, I pay tribute to both ministers. It's rather daunting to follow both of them after all the excellent work. But Charlie, you made a very good point at the start when you said that there's a lot of interest in reform now for an area that used to be the sort of dusty backwater. And I think that one very positive development that's come through in the last 13 years or so is the fact that there is permission to discuss, there's permission to criticise, and there's permission to say this is how it should be better. Because when I started working for Francis back in the old days of 2010, it was heresy to deviate from the civil service as the Rolls Royce. It's the best in the world. It's the jewel in the crown. And actually, if you can't actually say organisations need to do better, then it's a problem. That's not to say there aren't pockets of absolute brilliance, but it is important that we can do that. So I'm just going to pick out a few points. First of all, I totally echo Francis' point about the lack of accountability and the failure of anyone to be absolutely in charge in the civil service. He's quite right to have gone to the head of the civil service role and the stewardship obligation to make sure that the service is capable of serving governments of every stripe. And what are the biggest problems? I mean, if you had to say, look, you know, it's reimagining Whitehall, what would you want to do? I think one of the biggest things is actually a delivery organisation of civil service mainly. It's what, 500,000 people now maybe. You know, and it primarily delivers for citizens, and yet it's run by policy specialists or policy specialists, generalists who operate the sort of higher orders of Whitehall, but it's not run by the people who actually need to be able to run sort of large organisations. And to take the point about the head of the civil service normally being combined with the role of the cabinet secretary, the two are very, very different. I mean, what's a good generalist? You know, it's someone with, you know, great intellect, someone who can get on with ministers, someone who's got great ingenuity about solving problems. But, you know, this isn't the same as running a huge change management organisation. And we need to recognise that fact that these are very different skills, and empower somebody to look after the skills and bring on the talent. I'm not wading into the HS2 debate, except to say that I was, you know, rather upset that, you know, that a project is being called into question because we can't run it properly, because we can't manage the costs properly. I mean, goodness, aren't we signing these things off, you know, at the start, getting proper sort of proper people, somebody who is in charge, taking responsibility for the fact that these costs should be there, and you know that they can do it in sort of France or or Switzerland or Germany, that they can run railway services, why can't we? And it is this problem that you don't have somebody in charge taking responsibility and accountability for running large projects. You know, Permanent Secretary observed to France in the course of the review that they've been put in charge of a department, and they weren't equipped to be running a large, you know, organisation that had lots of delivery, arms-length bodies, etc. And it's ridiculous to assume that people should be able to do that. And just to go to, you know, I've named what is seen as a bit of a failure at the moment, but universal credit was a disaster when it started off. The policy was being developed in Whitehall, the IT development was in Warrington, the implementation was in Sheffield. So you can see, you know, it wasn't exactly set up for success. It had an IT system that was obviously not going to work straight away. It was a total mess. Whereas in fact, because of the government digital service, we brought in the digital service. They quietly, after the sort of disasters and being told it couldn't happen, they were brought in, they quietly got on with it, and universal credit is now actually a success story. It was able to deliver over COVID because the professionals were allowed to get on and run it without this nonsense sort of arguing with people who really didn't know what they were talking about. So that's when I come to my third point, which is if I could reimagine Whitehall, it would be take away the siloed nature. Absolutely, we should be looking at everything in a cross-cutting, cross-departmental way. You wouldn't set up an organisation with departments if you were starting from scratch. And too much time is spent brokering decisions because nobody has the power to be in charge. So you're constantly sort of going on fudges and brokering between departments when you should actually be able to act in the best interests of the taxpayer, the citizen. And that goes to my final point, which is that when we talk about civil service reform, we're normally talking about a desire to protect, you know, to safeguard, and there's always that worry. But there should be really a desire to do things better, to make it good, to make it work, to have, as you know, Jeremy says, the sort of the emphasis on training and skills and empowering people to maybe make mistakes, but actually to deliver it better rather than to be constantly arguing over the powers that you have and safeguarding those. Anyway, sorry, thank you.
Thank you so much. And Rich, clearly there's a lot of really important, as I say, reform very much aligned with some of these comments, kind of, I guess, very big framework changes. But there's actually the day-to-day, how do you make that work in a department, how do you get that delivery going, and I imagine you would have some thoughts to reflect on that end of the Whitehall reform.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Reform, for the event, and for everyone else who's spoken already. There's plenty of fuel in there for debate, so I'll try and keep my remarks short. As Charlie introed, I just want to briefly tell you who you need to know. So we are productivity specialists. We partner with government to unlock complex delivery. I hope, Francis, not to the frustration of civil servants, but maybe that's a conversation for another agenda item. But as Charlie says, it's our perspective down in the weeds that I want to come to this conversation on. And while I would agree with the points that have been raised about the importance of accountability, power structures, I would argue that equally important are the questions of behaviour, culture and skills on the ground. And I think the first point to bring to mind is, well, what is reform about? And to me, reform has to be about improving outcomes for people in receipt of public service. And so when we're discussing these changes in reimagining Whitehall, if we can't point to or ideally measure how those changes are going to improve outcomes, then why are we making those changes at all? And I think if we believe that, the next question that follows is, well, who are the people behind reform and behind change? And in my experience, all too often, these sorts of change decisions are driven from the centre of departments or the centre of government, a bit too distant from the operational reality of the delivery on the ground. And we've got plenty of examples of this from our work, but the one that sort of really highlights this to me is working with a central government department who were building a digital toolkit to enable frontline delivery. So absent from the fact that most of the frontline teams didn't have access to the internet, and that's got an interesting sort of analogy for how this works. And in fact, there was a 2021 NAO report which studied management teams, and they said in 50% of the teams studied, there was a disconnect between the strategic intent of the organisations and the operational reality on the front line. So reform has to be made in this context of operational reality, but it also has to empower those frontline teams to own and drive reform forward, otherwise we're not going to see it stick. And so while all these changes like the 12,000 civil servants moving out of London I think should be applauded, the question for me is how do we make sure that they really are observing and understanding the reality of frontline delivery and the communities they serve and bringing that back into policy making decisions. My second point was going to be an observation on this point of the big leaps versus the small sort of constant attention. And I think in my observations, the big leaps require time and energy, significant amounts of time and energy, and at times that can detract from the day-to-day business of delivery. Now that isn't to say we shouldn't make big leaps, I think big leaps are important, but I think the question is, when we do make big leaps, how does that enforce a culture of continual improvement, and how do we make sure those big leaps are towards building a Whitehall machine that adapts and changes as is required on an ongoing basis, reducing the need for those big leaps in the future. And I think that this culture of continuous improvement is at the key to this, and culture is a big topic, right? But in Gove's 2020 Ditchley lecture, he said that of the 108 major projects that government is responsible for, only 8% were assessed to judge if they've been delivered effectively or had brought about the required outcomes. And so perhaps without evaluation and reflection a core part of what we do, it's not surprising that we rely more on those big leaps and that constant attention that the Minister talked about. And so the growth of the government evaluation function, the recent introduction of the efficiency framework, I think are both really positive steps in this regard. But more needs to be done to raise the base level of skills around data and analysis, so that the constant evaluation of the work that is done becomes the norm, not the exception that's done 80% of the time. And finally, on that point of skills, I think more needs to be done to grow the range and diversity of skills within government to keep pace with the standard of public service that the public is going to expect to be delivered. Great leaps have been made over the last couple of decades, and we talked about that in terms of the attraction and retention of talent, and the sort of digital secondments statement is a really positive one. I think the Cabinet Secretary's announcement of 50% of fast streamers would be from technical backgrounds, I think is another positive step in this direction. But as Reform's recent report, Breaking Down Barriers, points out, too often these skills play second fiddle to policymakers. And if we're saying reform has to be about outcomes, if we're saying that we need operational staff to be at the forefront of that, and we need to measure and evaluate all the work that we do, clearly those skills need to be better valued and better harnessed at the centre of government in driving this change. So I think that the summary from me is reform is about improving outcomes. We have to put the people responsible for delivering outcomes at the heart of reform, and we have to empower them with the right skills to evaluate and assess that on an ongoing basis.
Brilliant, thank you so much. There's a huge amount in there. I think that's probably written our next paper before. Thank you to the four of you for doing that. But also, I do think it's remarkable actually. A lot of the events you'll go to, there'll be quite a lot of it's really hard, it's really difficult, and isn't all this stuff going wrong? But actually, what you've heard there is it is hard, it is difficult, and there is stuff we need to improve. There's also a huge amount that actually is really positive, that's actually going on now to improve things, and being led by the Cabinet Office, which I think is great. I want to just reflect one comment, and I'm going to go straight to the audience. My Director of Policy, wherever he is, set precedent this morning in our fabulous space conversation about the chair not being able to ask questions, so I feel like I might have to go straight. But I just want to give one quote from the Breaking Down the Barriers paper, which if you haven't read, please do, because it's focused on paper that came out not long ago. It's focused on exactly that question that Lord Maude said, which is we all kind of agree roughly on what's wrong, so why on earth haven't we managed to change it? And it's precisely looking at what those barriers are and some of the stuff that Lord Maude said. But one of the I think it was one of the former permanent secretaries, it was indeed actually, I can remember who it was now, did interviews with former permanent secretaries, former cabinet secretaries, etc. And one said to us, summing up I think some of the reflections actually we've had from everyone here, he said the trouble is, nobody wants to be John Manzoni, they all want to be Jeremy Haywood. And that for me captured a lot of what we've just heard. And so it's not just about skills, it's not just about the brilliant evaluation metrics, all that kind of stuff, but it's actually about how are you holding up those people as being the top and making people want to be that person. And that for me, it just felt like such a brilliant, because John Manzoni did huge amounts. I mean, one of the innovations again, unfortunately during the Maude era. But for a former Pum Sec to say that, I think was quite striking. Anyway, I will shut up now. I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to take 3 because I'm hoping we're going to have lots. So if you can keep your questions very short, not statements, please. Questions for the panel, because we are going to get as much in as we can. I'll take this gentleman here, then the gentleman there, and then the lady at the back.
Yeah, very quickly, I was a civil servant in 1994, I wrote a book, BPR in the Public Sector. I went to the Cabinet Office to a nice party where I met the Perm Sec, and he said, I've read your book, it's great. He said, but we don't want it in the Cabinet Office, thanks very much. In 2014, I was brought back into the Civil Service as Senior IT Project Manager for part of the Home Office that was looking after police. I said, why have we got 56 computer systems in the police service? Because we do not want to upset chief constables. That was the answer. We do not want to upset. So we have a very, very difficult cultural barrier to get over. And Lord Maude mentioned the cultural barrier, and I think it's really down to you, Jeremy, to do something about this. But both of those things, separate, are just stupid.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Can we overcome the stupid things? I think it's a great opening question, which I think is spot on there. And the gentleman just here.
Yes, thanks. First of all, I thank the panel very much. My own experience in delivery actually goes back to the day of
Can I ask people to focus on the question, just so that we make sure we get through as many people as possible?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just preface it by, I think one of the best summaries I ever saw of the problem of delivery was by Victor Church, the former Prime Minister of China, where he said we started off with the very best intentions, but then everything just turned out as normal. And I think that, what my real question is that I've just finished working with the Prime Minister of Jordan on the delivery in the Prime Minister's office over in Jordan. They started up with the same problem. We need to be having the right people doing the right things at the right time. And what we've really been focused on is actually capturing the real data in real time, so that rather than reading evaluation reports on why things went wrong, we're actually able to capture that data in real time and intervene. I mean, I think that's the essence of delivery, so that we actually are not getting to ends of projects, just reading about, looking in the rear mirror and seeing what went wrong. We need to intervene in real time.
Sorry, could you just tell us who you are?
I'm Graham Hutton. I'm Chair of Newcastle and Lyme Conservatives and a County Councillor.
Great, thank you.
And I'm Tony Getty, currently a Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of Jordan.
Perfect, thank you. And then just the lady at the back. And again, if you can introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hi, it's Baroness Mason Whitehall, editor of The Guardian. It's a question for Lord Maude about this, the potential for a head of the civil service role, returning to that sort of model. What kind of extra powers are you talking here? Is this the power of if you want to empower them, is it hiring and firing powers? Is there anything else that would be given to them to make them really effective in the transformation exercise? And secondly, when you're saying that also other countries don't have this sort of great big monolith of a treasury, that you could, finance and economic is in different areas, are you suggesting potential breakup of the treasury in this house?
Well, you'll have to, on that last point, you'll have to wait for the publication of my review to find my definitive conclusion on that. But I simply make the point that we are out of alignment with similar governments. What was your first?
The first one is about how do you empower that head of the civil service? What's the
Okay, so what powers? Okay, so first of all, we've never had one. There was only for one short period, Ian Bancroft, when there was a civil service department, was permanent secretary of that and head of the civil service. But even then, the powers to run the civil service were divided between that department and the Treasury. So you had control over pay. So when you're trying to do workforce planning with the civil service, you have the Cabinet Office, which has responsibility for overall but very diluted responsibility for the overall shape of the civil service. But the Treasury, who control pay, and the idea that you can do workforce planning with those things being done. I mean, when one of Jeremy's predecessors embarked on a program to reduce the size of the civil service, I got contacted separately by him to talk about how did we do it when we were there, and by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Totally different people in the room, but both of them regarded themselves as being the key people for driving this policy. Insane, absolutely insane that those things are being managed separately. So at the moment, the only formal delegations that have been made of the Prime Minister's power to manage civil service have been made not to civil servants but to ministers. And I absolutely guarantee that no minister has ever seen the letter that delegates those powers. And they're not hire and fire powers, but they are quite wide-ranging powers around shape and size of the civil service in your department. But there is no such delegation to the head of the civil service. And I have helpfully drafted such a letter of delegation that included in one of the many annexes of my report in order to be helpful. Because there's no point in blaming the head of the civil service for failing to deliver civil service reform if the poor fellow hasn't been provided, A, with the training and the background needed to drive something so incredibly complicated and hard, or the authority to make it happen. So, you know, it has to be very specifically set out.
So it's about shaping Wales.
Sorry, I want to make sure that we can answer the other questions that we've got as well. Thank you so much. I also think it's brilliant we're getting like the trailer for the Maude review to come out, so that is brilliant. Can I pick up, Jeremy? I do want to pick up those quite specific questions there, which I think are great questions. So the one there that we had around, it's quite difficult, you're sitting at the centre of government, if actually, you know, you can take the NHS as much as you can take policing, if you've got this very fragmented model, and how do you manage that when you've got a vision for deploying technology and data, which I think also links then to the gentleman's question about how do you get the real-time data information to actually be able to know whether something's working or not, and then to be able to pivot if it's not.
Well, I had this gentleman isn't the only person who asked that question about computers. About this time last year, rather briefly, I was the policing minister, and I wanted to compare data between different police forces. To find out that was completely impossible on the grounds of the nature of the different computing systems, and then I asked about cost. Well, that's all really up to the individual forces and the individual PCCs. And to your point, and policing is complex. You know, we believe in operational independence of the police, of course. But right the way across government, there is a risk that we conflate having the processes to make people accountable with saying, that means it, over to you, wash our hands, and you get on with it. Well, on things like data, it is incredibly important, if people are going to be accountable, that you can actually see what is happening. I'm not talking about any particular area of government here, but I am saying that the direction we're heading on with AI across the economy, without the right data sets, AI doesn't get you anywhere. And making certain that you have those data sets and have the talent and the skills in order to devise those data sets and in order to drive down costs, those are all very strong rationales for units to work out of their silos to create common platforms by which they can be judged in an appropriate way.
Can I just pick up that point, because I think, and develop it a bit, because I think it's absolutely right. We wrestled with a lot of these issues around what I would call the wider public sector, so obviously local government, but also NHS, police, fire, etc. And people would say, well, you're doing all this great stuff with central government and, you know, the functional model, the cross-cutting function, strong level. Why can't you do this with police, etc.? And my colleague Nick Herbert, who, when he was Minister for Policing, tried to address some of these issues that you talked about with the police. And the reality is that given the commitment to operational independence, there's a limit to what you can mandate. But the one thing in terms of you must do this, you must buy all your uniforms from the same supplier to get the economies of scale. You must do kind of IT purchasing, fleet, cars, vehicles, etc. Huge savings that could be made. And the answer is transparency. It's exactly Jeremy's point. We introduced for central government, and it was unbelievably painful, a system of having comparable data for common areas of spend across the whole of just central government, so Whitehall departments. The very distinguished businessman I persuaded to do the work on this, said to me one day, Francis, if you see a body floating down the Thames, it'll be mine, because the resistance across Whitehall to being judged, to being compared, was so huge. Because what they all do, and you'll find this police, all of these areas, they all say, oh, you can't compare what we do with, because what we do is completely different. And of course there are differences, but there's a whole lot that gets done that is absolutely comparable. And where you think there are differences, you can explain it. And transparency is the answer. So I always thought with the NHS and with police and with all, and local government as well, the thing which I think the central government should have no inhibitions at all about imposing is data standards, standard definitions. You know, why is it that we have common accounting standards for corporations, for businesses? So you can compare, you can benchmark, it's transparent. And why should we not have that within all of these public sector sort of subsectors, have absolutely Stalinistic imposed data standards so you can make comparison. And then you can start to do, for procurement of things like IT and so on, you can have big centrally negotiated deals which will give you better pricing because of the power of size. And if you want to do something else, fine, you do it, but you explain. You explain to your local taxpayer, council taxpayers or whatever, why it is you're doing something which is different and more expensive. And there may be perfectly good reasons for it, but you can explain it.
Thank you. I personally will probably be bolder and say that the type of IT system you have to record crime has nothing to do with operational independence.
No, I know.
And actually we should say that all police forces
Spain
that
did
crime
it.
doesn't end at a border, and it might be nice if they could talk to each other. But
Spain did it, they got a system and us.
I completely agree, but we can probably say that. I want to just quickly bring in Rich though on this data point, because I mean, you know, Newsmail doing an awful lot on this, whether it's in local government or backlog stuff in central government. That question about the quality of data, the accessibility of the data government holds, the standardisation across areas, I mean, this is a huge issue.
And I think the question itself about live data is a particularly insightful one, because I think that is often the crux of this. And I think in our experience, analytical resource in government is still relatively sparse. So if we work on the principle that there's not enough of it, we then look at where it's prioritised and focused. And in my experience, the majority of it is spent looking what might happen at some point in the future. Some of it is spent what happened in the past, and that middle ground of what's happening today doesn't really exist. And I think that there's two main drivers to that. I think one is the capacity to do that and the prioritisation of doing it. So that's just a question about what we prioritise. The second one that we come across, which is interesting, is almost a fear that if you have that, it then becomes the external measure that you use. And I think there's something we need to get around, which is we might have external transparency measures that we use for reporting on a set frequency. That doesn't have to be the same as the day-to-day operational metrics that get used to drive performance. And so what happens currently is too often those operational metrics are left to be sort of Heath Robinson constructed by the teams that need them, rather than organised and created in an essential way. And I think that is a question of prioritisation and capacity that we need to get over.
And as Rich said earlier, evaluation is an incredibly important process. So if you know from the outset how you're going to evaluate the operation you're conducting, that really does help focus the mind from the outset. How are we going to evaluate it? How are we going to judge it?
And if you're evaluating on a daily basis and then a weekly basis and then a monthly basis, you'll find you have much clearer answers than if you only sit down every month or 6 months to try and work out what's happened.
And that's how you then join up the dots, the accountability question. I'm going to take another set questions again. I'm really conscious, obviously, it's the best topic to be talking about at party conference, but we do have a lot we want to ask, so really brief if you can be. So, sorry, put your hand back up so I saw. So, Alex there, the gentleman there, and then the gentleman there in the pink tie.
Thanks, John. I'm Alex Thomas from the IFG, the Institute for Government. Alex Thomas from the Institute for Government. I wanted to ask about the setting of administrative budgets and who does it and how, and whether the panel had thoughts on how best to resolve the problem of sort of departmental accountability for budget setting versus cost-cutting priorities, but also the tension that I think could become inherent in some of your Maude's thinking about who has the ultimate power to set budgets, ministers or civil servants, and how you resolve that in a way that is democratically proper.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Chris Beard, Hampstead Capital. Just the question was, do you, question to Jeremy probably, is there more that Whitehall could do to utilise private sector capital and expertise to speed up delivery, make up for the skill shortage, and actually provide real examples of benefits that the electorate can see?
Thanks. Nick Guttridge from the Telegraph. Jeremy, you mentioned a couple of pieces of work you're working on, the performance-related pay and the working from home guidance. I wonder if you see those two things as being linked. In other words, the more you're in the office, the more productive you are, therefore, the more you will be paid in the future. And sort of linked to that really as well. There have been a few stories. It seems now every time a sort of crisis erupts, one of the first stories you get is how many civil servants are working from home. I think it was 50%, for instance, when the rack thing in schools occurred. Do you think the working from home has made civil servants sort of less responsive, if you like, to those kind of events?
Thank you. Jeremy, shall we start with you with that last question?
Yes, by all means. On working from home, there's two aspects here. Capability-based pay, I think it's a misnomer. It should be about delivery and performance and operational success. And being able to say, yeah, this is what I can deliver, this is how I've delivered it. So it's not a tick box exercise around the number of training. Training is incredibly important, but the fact that you've been on 12 training programs doesn't make you inherently more capable. It's how you can deploy that and prove that you can make it work. And as does, sticking with the project for some time, one of the infuriating things to which Francis referred, Fulton I think was 68, wasn't it? And in Fulton it refers to the importance of keeping civil servants in post for long enough to prove what they've done, what they're capable of. And there are brilliant people who are absolutely capable of it. And that was then picked up by about 3 other reports. One was picked up by Blair, I think, in 2004, and then by you, Francis, in 2013. Everybody had agreed on it, back to Fulton, and probably before that, never actually been operationalised. So when you actually say to people, this is your task, this is what you need to prove, this is how you're going to deliver, and yes, we of course are going to reward productivity. When you can prove that you can actually do this stuff and you do deliver it, that doesn't mean there's a direct link between that and the number of hours spent in the office, but team productivity, learning from each other, driving innovation, all of that is important, and all of that is part of the components of making certain that we have a civil service that really performs. And as I say, the current guidance on working from home dates from just after COVID. Doesn't mean it's appropriate for what's happening right now. Private sector has been reviewing this, as are we.
So I want to, because you mentioned the siloed nature in your opening remarks, so I wonder if I could come to you on this question around if budgets are done in a kind of siloed departmental process, how do we, where we have cross-cutting issues, of which there are several today we could talk about, how do we set budgets that can deliver against cross-cutting issues, and is there a change we need? And then I'm going to come to Francis and Rich, if I can, on the question about the private sector and whether we've got that right balance and what more we could do actually to create that porosity.
Can I duck and do private sector then? Because on the cross-cutting budgets, I know that Francis has very strong views on it, and I have quite some strong views on the private sector expertise and why we don't use it enough.
By all means.
Francis.
Well, on budgets, the way the Treasury theology militates strongly against that. Treasury theology says that, and I think I'm speaking at an event you've got later today or tomorrow on exactly this issue, so I won't blow all my powder on this stage. But this kind of rigid insistence that you've got to have a single accounting officer responsible, everything has got to be in a departmental budget with an accounting officer accountable to Parliament, and that the idea that you could have a matrix as it is a kind of massively radical new concept that's only just emerged onto the consciousness of Whitehall is strange. But that's what militates against it, and I will expand on that later. Just on the working from home thing, I'm a heretic on this, because I think that actually for people who do non-manual things, although everything we do is to some extent manual, there's some research that shows that the most productive combination is people working 3 or 4 days in the office, 1 or 2 days at home. What doesn't work is if everyone works the same times at home. So in Whitehall, I used occasionally to spend a Friday, to the great annoyance of my office, wandering around Whitehall, and it's like walking through the Gobi Desert. I mean, they're a great arid wasteland, but there's just no one there. And this was way before COVID or anything like that. But people can be very productive working from home. And when during the Olympics in 2012, we wanted to promote people moving out, not all having to come into central London. And then people said, well, how will we know whether people are working? And I said, well, the answer is you judge them on what they're producing. Is that a concept? Outputs, rather than can I see them sitting at their desk. So I'm a heretic on working from home. I think it can be very productive, but it's the right combination.
And it needs to be managed.
And it needs to be managed, absolutely.
I don't think that's too far. I don't think that's too great.
I have to say, I love coming into Westminster on a Friday now because it's so quiet.
Yeah.
So it's a joy. So when you want to pick up the private sector, and then Rich, if I can ask you the same. I am conscious we've only got a few minutes left of the session.
Okay, just quickly on the budget, because the other point I would make on what Francis has just said is that the Treasury also doesn't show any interest in how the money is spent once it's been allocated, and there needs to be some real-time oversight of how that money that they've allocated is being spent. And there's a great deal of resistance to that in Whitehall. It's not just a cost-cutting thing; it's actually monitoring and consistent monitoring of value for money
In real time.
On the private sector expertise, I don't want to hark back too much to the Catherine Baxendale report that we did in the coalition, but it did explain in quite intense detail why external people were rejected. There was tissue rejection in Whitehall. But just to give you an example of how difficult it is, and I just failed to understand, every single civil service reform plan that I've seen, declaration of government, etc., has always had this thing that we should have secondments. What a great idea they are between the private sector and the civil service. And they never happen. I mean, I think there have been about 10 when I got back, and they just don't seem to happen. And I was rather interested to see that Jonathan Slater, I think, in an IFG panel, had come up with the fact that someone was told by their permanent secretary, you don't want to do that secondment because you'll go away and we'll all forget about you. And you need so there's
we heard that as well.
I mean, and it's just really shocking that there is no central talent management system where you're monitoring your best people, you're training them up, and actually there's someone with an interest that you just get forgotten about because you want to do something to improve yourself and to bring skills back in. And so it's A, the treatment of people who are brought in from outside, and B, the way that civil servants are not actively encouraged with their careers properly managed to be able to perform better.
I think brief addition on skills. So my first observation would be the civil service has as capable skills as any of the private sector organisations that we work with. The question is more one of capacity and deployment. And so all we talked about previously about how do you attract and retain that talent is important. I think in the meantime, though, we need to be careful not to fall into the two traps. One of just outsourcing capacity, because that masks a range of other issues within this other service. And the other is one of outsourcing problems, because if you outright outsource the problems, you never learn to organise yourself around the solution. So it's that in-between ground of how you bring in capability that is complementary, additive, and build sustainability that's important in getting that dynamic right.
And just to pick up that point, that is absolutely right. You need to have the problem solving as internal as possible, but related to people doing implementation. Just on the resistance to outside influence, and I've spoken about this before, but I still can't get my head around how it happened and why it happened. We took a decision back in, I think, 2013, that all the permanent secretaries who had a reasonable time span ahead of them should go through 3-month top leadership courses at the top business schools, Harvard, Stanford, INSEAD, etc. and there was huge resistance from the then head of the civil service, which I finally overcame. The objection was, oh well, these courses cost $70,000. I said, these are people we're putting in charge of tens of billions of pounds a year. Eventually, I ground it down and got agreement. And then it simply didn't happen. It just didn't happen at the end of it, just when it got to the 2015 election, and I was on my way out. And my own permanent secretary said, I've done it. He said, I went, and he said, he spent a week at IMD in Lausanne. So instead of 3 months at Harvard and Stanford, if 1 week in Lausanne, he said it was fine, Francis, but it wasn't what you had in mind. And the idea just got killed. And I've heard since from people who are on the inside that it got deliberately killed. Why? You know, we complain when things get done badly, but we're putting people in charge of these huge budgets with woefully inadequate preparation. And it is that thing that you referred to, Charlotte, that, you know, I want to be Jeremy Haywood, not John Manzoni. John Manzoni would have been through one of these things. And you don't get to be the leader
Jeremy did
of...
in fairness too.
But he then didn't value it. And that's what you have to... But I think what was behind it was a sort of combination of sort of insecurity. We don't want our people to be compared with people, a peer group from other sectors with different experience, and a bit of arrogance, and a bit, you know, we've got nothing to learn from interaction with other sectors.
But it's also the fear of being out of the system. That's to go to that point. That people are worried because if the careers are not being properly managed, that they're out of the system and they will be forgotten about. And I think that is.
But the irony is that and this is a huge one of many bits of frustration. Speaking as someone who was on secondment into the Treasury for a couple of years, when you're in there, the middle ranks of the civil service, many of whom are brilliant, as we know, are very keen, many of them, to say, how would you approach this? What would the private sector do? How would you actually tackle this particular problem? So, and if it's simply uncertain, if civil servants have the opportunity of having comments outside of the private sector, when they return, their skills will be valued and people will see it as an important thing to do. It is a mental block to actually...
It's a culture.
It's a culture.
That's exactly what we could, as you can see, talk all day and probably through tomorrow and on to Wednesday when the press conference will finish, but we can't, and I'm sure the Minister, as well as the panellists, probably have a full day of other events to go to. I want to call out one statement that the Minister has said in his opening remarks, which I hope we take away, which is you're wanting to expand and stretch your ambitions for Whitehall and for Whitehall reform, and I think if you can take that away, then that is a brilliant statement of intent in terms of making this machine work as well as it can for all the citizens in this country. So thank you so much to the community for supporting this. Thank you so much to our brilliant panellists for their candid reflections. We actually have an in conversation with Lord Maude at the end of October when hopefully the report will be out and we can get into the weeds of what you brilliantly laid out as a kind of taster of what's to come. So Minister, thank you so much. Francis, Simone and Rich, thank you so much for joining us today.